So, we are here for the winter edition of the Faith and Science kind of ongoing discussion series. In the fall, we had Dr. Tim Flanagan, who talked a little about his experience as a doctor, a medical doctor, and sort of the ethical questions that he has dealt with in his own ministry, his own service. And the winter issue, if you can call it that, is on 3 articles that Dr. Zins and I picked out, which are summarized kind of in the handout that I gave, and I'll go through that in a minute. But all these articles had to do with the idea of human dignity. That was the thing that we thought would be really kind of fertile for discussion. And specifically, several of the articles have to do with sort of childbearing and prenatal kind of diagnosis, right? What does that mean when you learn that your child might have some sort of genetic issue? What do ethics tell us about how, what decisions to make, and specifically what do Christian ethics kind of tell us? So we picked 3 articles, or 2 articles from the summer edition of this magazine, Plough Quarterly, which was about medicine, and then we picked an essay, a chapter really, from this book by the ethicist Gilbert Meilaender, and that's what we kind of excerpted from his book. So basically, I don't think everyone is quite super familiar with the articles, which is fine. So what I think I'll do is I'll just kind of run through real quick, kind of explain to you what each of the writers is arguing, and then we'll open it up for the panel questions, which are on the other handout, and then hopefully we'll have time at the end where you guys can ask your own questions. I think that's really ideally where we want to go. We want you to generate your own questions. Preview of coming attractions in the spring. We're hoping to have a student essay contest where instead of having teachers up here talking to you about the way things are, you guys can come and say, if there's a number of essays submitted for this essay contest, the best, say 3 or 4 will come up here and read your essays and kind of hear feedback from a panel of teachers. So that's still in the works, but if you're interested in this, watch out for that. We'll have an essay prompt based on these articles that you guys can respond to in the spring. So. Good, okay, so the first article was from Father Nicanor, Austriaco. If you were here last year, you might remember that he came and spoke to us about, I think he spoke specifically about evolution, kind of understanding evolution through the lens of biblical kind of theology. But he's a bioethicist. He's a professor at PC, a Dominican. And in his article, he talks about the difference between gene editing done therapeutically, right, in order to sort of heal or prevent illness, and gene editing done non-therapeutically, which is more features and qualities of a child that may be desirable. So I'll read a couple of these quotes here just to kind of give you a little greatest hits of his article. First quote. In contrast, faith-based ethicists believe that human beings have dignity that can never be diminished or lost. The Judeo-Christian tradition holds that humans have intrinsic dignity based on the belief that we are made in the image and likeness of God. This dignity thus cannot be lost from conception until death, no matter the apparent indignities a person suffers. It is on this that I base my opposition to non-therapeutic gene editing. Children should be welcomed and not designed. And that's basically his thesis, that he doesn't necessarily oppose gene editing for therapeutical reasons, right, to prevent a condition from happening later on that maybe a child is susceptible to, but he opposes it on non-therapeutic grounds, like if you want your child to have blue eyes or brown hair or something like that. I'll just read the last sentence of that second quote, which is another sort of major idea of his. He says, for these reasons, and there are many more, children should be begotten and not made. And that's the title of his article as well. The second article is kind of the central, I think, piece of our 3 articles here. And this is by a woman named Sarah Williams. She's a professor at Oxford. And this is an excerpt from a book that she just published this year, I believe. And she speaks about her own experience with her own daughter that who she discovered had a fatal condition in the womb. gonadotrophic dysplasia, which is a fatal, I'll let the scientists talk about that later on, but it's a fatal condition. And she speaks about how she was, her first reaction was that she needed to terminate the pregnancy, right? She was someone who considered herself pro-life, anti-abortion, but she thought immediately, like, this is unnecessary suffering. And she had a really kind of profound moment where she felt that she was called to carry the child. And I'll read these two quotes from her because they're pretty powerful. She says, one university medic presented the moral arguments in favor of abortion in a robust fashion. To fail to abort in the case of proven fetal abnormality is morally wrong, because in doing so, one is deliberately bringing avoidable suffering into the world. It is an ethical imperative to abort in the case of suboptimal life. And she's quoting a university medic from Oxford, I imagine. And then this is sort of her last paragraph in her essay, which is her kind of, her money quote, so to speak. She says, limitation, finitude, suffering, weakness, disability, and frailty can be gifts. Far from robbing us of our humanity, these things are needed if we are to be human. Without them, we strip ourselves of the opportunity to confer dignity on each other, regardless of our physical and mental condition, and we lose sight of the essential givenness of human life. Ultimately, personhood is not a work of self-definition and self-creation. Instead, it is a gift. So you hear a common theme here, that humanity and dignity should be considered something given and not something conferred on someone else. And then the last article here from the Meilaender book, he kind of works with two different ideas of dignity. He calls one idea human dignity, which is sort of something that we can account for variables in, right? So someone may have an increase in dignity if they are really, they provide something that's really beneficial to human life or communities, or if someone's very, very skilled at something. That is a certain kind of dignity, he said. And there's another kind of dignity he calls it personal dignity, which is more universal, right? And he tries to wrestle with those two concepts in his article. His quote here that I pulled out, he says, we are equal to each other, whatever our differences in human flourishing, precisely because none of us is the maker of another one of us. We all have received our life equally as a gift from the Creator. So again, that common theme of receiving life as a gift is a kind of a Christian, Judeo-Christian notion that each of these three authors touches upon. So, to the questions. I thought we'd start with question 3 and question 4 on this list, because they kind of give us a groundwork in maybe talking a little bit about what actually happens when you talk about genetic editing in the womb, right? What actually goes on, what can you do, what can't you do? Obviously this is changing very, very quickly, right? These things are cutting edge technology. So maybe we can just start with question 3. Could you genetically correct or edit existing conditions like Down syndrome? Or is the only option besides carrying to term terminating the pregnancy? So what can you affect with this sort of therapeutic genetic editing? Scientists.
So, how many of you have heard of CRISPR? All right, good. How many of you can tell us what it is? Lila, give it a shot.
It's a gene editing tool.
Yes, it is.
That's all I can tell you.
Right. It's an enzyme, which is basically, it's an enzyme complex, which is basically a protein that does something that originated in bacteria to cut up viral sequences, because viruses infect bacteria all the time. Bacteria needed to evolve a way to deal with those invaders and to chop up their genome so that more viruses wouldn't be made over and over again. And like anything that happens in nature, molecular biologists and geneticists make use of this technology in order to do the same thing. So CRISPR, in a very short sense, is a very targeted way to cut and paste your genes. And the reason why this is so powerful is because it's manipulating your actual DNA, not the RNA message that's made, not the protein that's made later. You can take out completely a gene from your genome so that it is no longer there. It's gone permanently. Or alternatively, you could put a correct, and by correct I mean a non-mutated version of that gene in its place. So it's very powerful because it's very targeted, and it's very sort of final and complete. Like once you take it out, it's gone. If you're able to put something back, that's what's there, and that's what gets made every time that cell divides. And when you do it in utero, or while a pregnancy is happening, when it's at an early stage, every subsequent cell that divides from those early set of cells has that same correction or manipulation that CRISPR uses. So this is really what we're talking about when we talk about this gene editing technology, just so we have an idea of where we're going. And maybe Mr. Green can talk about the Down syndrome part.
Yeah, so as far as Down syndrome goes, and I don't know, it sounds like this question's not super specific, but let's talk about it for a second. Down syndrome's a little bit different than some other genetic disorders in that it involves the extra presence of a chromosome. So you have 23 pairs of chromosomes, one's inherited maternally, one's paternally. And Down syndrome is the case where you have, instead of the normal 2 copies of chromosome 21, 3 copies of chromosome 21. So that, correcting that would be different than going in and picking out one gene and changing it. And there's a lot of challenges in Down syndrome research, not the least of which is figuring out, okay, of all the genes carried on chromosome 21, right, which of these, when present in 3 copies, are leading to some of the symptoms of the disorder. So that's a really loaded question, and it's not necessarily super easy to solve that. So as far as Down syndrome goes, and there are ways that maybe scientists can think of possibly getting rid of the chromosome at an early stage using CRISPR technology, but it's much less feasible than just going in and targeting one gene, right, with one guide RNA that's going to bring the enzyme involved in CRISPR, what's known as Cas9, to that gene and then correcting it. So as far as Down syndrome goes, not really a target per se for some of this tech, but what's interesting about this question is it kind of gets into the therapeutic versus non-therapeutic side, where we're reaching kind of a gray area. I mean, Down syndrome is pretty much seen as a disorder that, though debilitating in some ways, is people who have Down syndrome, individuals who have Down syndrome, can lead fairly normal lives. So if we're saying that, if we bring up the question of correcting this in embryo in an early stage, then are we essentially saying that someone with Down syndrome doesn't have the same value as someone without it, which is kind of a loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, we could, I think we'll probably get there eventually.
Yeah, and then as far as other disorders, so kind of like Steve said, yeah, theoretically, yes, if there's an inherited genetic disorder and we can map it to one gene, one location in the genome, theoretically at a very early stage in embryonic development, we could use CRISPR to edit in a correction or edit out that gene that's causing the issues there.
Mostly those are, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but those are questions where, all right, this child may be susceptible to sickle cell anemia or something, right? Where, like, they're not able to actually go in and fix an existing issue, like.
I mean, like in an adult,
Or even in a child, like even in an unborn child, are they able to actually correct a problem that would be life-threatening otherwise?
well, there are conditions that are directly linked to specific mutations in specific genes.
Mm-hmm.
So the very relatively few conditions that are linked that way, yes, you could go in, target like a GPS to that specific area of the genome, cut out the mutated version, and put in a normalized sequence, so that that mutation that confers that very direct link to that condition will no longer be there.
Maybe we can kind of get on to question 4 here, which is kind of what we're already talking about, right? How do you distinguish therapeutic genetic editing from non-therapeutic? So, for example, what distinguishes preventing suffering that can be prevented from saying, well, you know, I would like it if my child has certain qualities that we can control and manipulate through genetic editing. This is what Father Nicanor called designer babies. How do you, where's the line? This is,
Well, I talk in my class a lot about, like, you know, there's certain genetic disorders that, like Steve said, we can map to one spot in the genome. And then there's, you know, I want my kid to have blonde hair. You know, and I think that in that light, it's pretty easy to wrap your head around what it is, but I think that there's definitely a lot of gray area there as well, where you have to, you know, basically think about, okay, what possible genetic disorders, you know, maybe don't fall under that category of therapeutic. And again, that's maybe something where the individual could live a largely normal lifestyle. And then you get into the question of, well, what defines normalness? All right, what's that? Who gets to decide that? And Steve, I don't know, you might know more about this. I just can't think of the guidelines off the top of my head, but, you know, scientists have guidelines for basically what would need to be, you know, if we were to do gene editing in embryo, what conditions would need to be met in order for us to do that? And, you know, it's basically, you know, a set of principles that state, you know, there has to almost be, you know, very little other option. It has to be a, you know, fairly horrifying disorder. You know, I don't know, Steve, do you?
Broadly, I've seen it put, is it restorative or is it augmentive? So if the condition is your body isn't producing the right amount of insulin, can that be restored so that your body does produce the right amount of insulin? If you are blind, can you restore sight? It is not if, okay, you have a slight deficiency in lung capacity, can we make you like an X-Man and increase your lung capacity? Those types of things. Or traits that are chosen based on their aesthetic appeal. So I think the therapeutic term would be you're restoring some imbalance in the body that, broadly speaking, in the human population is supposed to be within a certain range. And if you're trying to restore something like that, then it would be considered therapeutic. But if it's not, if you're just trying to improve something or take something that you don't want away, or if it's just an aesthetic trait, then it would be considered non-therapeutic.
I have a question, I guess, for the scientist, is also to what extent in the scientific community would this be seen as sort of an experimental therapy? Like how confident would doctors be that, you know, this CRISPR technology would do what you are thinking it will do? Or to what extent are you sort of experimenting with an actual human using it?
I think it says a lot that the scientific community today was horrified when they learned at a recent conference that a Chinese scientist had actually performed CRISPR on a set of twins and basically just announced this at a conference, and all the geneticists were like, what? You did what? Because you're not allowed to do that in the United States. And the consensus right now is, yes, we know it works mechanistically like in a culture dish, but we have not done enough testing to understand what may happen 5, 10, 20 years down the road. And I see Mr. Green has a perfect paper in front of him that I'm going to let him talk about.
Yeah, so one of the things with CRISPR that scientists are worried about is what are known as off-target effects. So basically, the Cas9 enzyme that's going to actually go in and do the cutting of the DNA, that'll either disable the gene or allow you to insert your healthy copy of the gene, needs to be guided to a certain place in the genome. And it's guided there by an RNA molecule, right, that has a match of 20 to 25 basically letters of the genetic code. Now, you have a lot of letters in your DNA, so what are the chances that that 20 to 25 base pair sequence occurs somewhere else, or maybe even a 17 base pair sequence that's super duper similar and can match good enough? What are the chances that that occurs somewhere else, and God forbid in a gene that when mutated might predispose you to cancer? So scientists are really concerned about these off-target effects, because basically the guide RNA is going to match with any DNA sequence that is complementary to it. So that could be your target gene, or that could, if you aren't aware of it, could be another gene. Now, you see a lot of discussion about, the efficiency of CRISPR, is it gonna be efficient enough to target the gene that you want and hopefully nothing else? Or is there that risk of off-target effects? And what's interesting is that some scientists say, basically with a really well-designed molecule, you can basically limit the off-target effects to being less than what the kind of background level of mutation would be in any given cell, just based off of random mistakes, by the cellular machinery, which is interesting. But again, it's still pretty. It's probably one of the biggest things that geneticists need to figure out about this technology before it can be really applied seriously. Certainly before it can be applied as seriously as that Chinese scientist that Steve alluded to applied it in basically editing an embryo two embryos that led to a pregnancy, which is not seen as ethically okay in the scientific community.
Those are pretty widespread opinion that this guy gone too far.
Oh, yeah.
You see the term rogue scientist. Or rogue.
Rogue and scientists are not two things you want to get in the same sentence. Good. Maybe we could talk about question 8, because this kind of speaks to the role of faith in particular, right? I mean, these are kind of the example we just talked about. Secular scientists, secular governments have said this is not a good idea, maybe because it's not proven yet, or maybe it's because it's kind of undesirable. But as a faith-based ethics, what does that have to say to these questions? I'll just read the question here. The bioethical questions posed in these writings seem to be framed by two human fears. The first can be described as a fear of living in adverse circumstances, economically, socially, and physically. The second, quite simply, is the fear of death. How does faith, or the lack thereof, play a role in bioethical decision-making? How do people of different faiths have similar or contrasting views? What does the Christian faith, even the Catholic faith, have to add that maybe general scientists do not to this topic?
About this one.
I think we should open this one up.
Let's do it. Somebody else.
Okay, I'll go. So I'm gonna refer to the Sarah Williams article.
Yeah.
And when she's describing, this moment when she is, her baby is about to die in her womb. And she uses this phrase, she feels like she has this transformative moment in which she experiences God's love, and she feels, she calls it a gentle imperative of love. And it's this command to love human life, for being first and foremost human, aside from any differences. And this is, the way that we experience a baby before we ever know anything about its gender, or how it sort of weighs up against this standard of normalcy. So I think, for Christians, that imperative to love, right, and to see God in every human life, and to love every human as Christ, really changes the way that we think about how to accept and welcome those different lives.
I'd also add that reading these articles, especially the Sarah Williams one, and her experience, it seems like this question, or the idea that all of our attempts to do gene editing, all this scientific exploration in this field, certainly is because of fear, right? That's what drives us, the fear of suffering. But what really struck me about her experience was that she had this sort of revolutionary moment where she talks about suffering as a gift, right? That we're not supposed to fear it always. And it seems to me that there's sort of a radical mind shift that we can sort of embrace in thinking about, right, if we really accept life as a total gift, something that we cooperate in as humans, right, we play a role, but it's not totally done by us. We are cooperating in God's plan. Then to try to control or to prevent suffering, which sometimes is necessary, it's not to say that that's a wrong thing, to try to control that all the time sort of heightens our fears of suffering, and it makes it very difficult to encounter suffering when it is out of our control. Right, that's the experience of being human necessarily involves suffering. Even if we get to the point where we can prevent suffering, just physical suffering to a great extent, life involves all kinds of other suffering. And if we constantly are trying to overcome different types of suffering in a scientific way, and what does that say for our ability to handle the suffering that we can't control? I think the fear, in a sense, is going to be heightened. And again, this is not to say that we shouldn't try to eliminate suffering, but that's certainly what struck me from that article. It makes it difficult to have this revolutionary change in perspective, to think that suffering might be a good thing or a gift for an individual.
I agree with what you've said. I also think, however, that we can say it's not only based on fear, but you could also frame it as based in hope, or, you know, the desire for something better, to strive, like we strive for health or fitness or culture, you know, to live well, not simply, like Aristotle said, to live well and not simply to live. So I think you could, you know, give it the benefit of the doubt to some extent that the motivation can be fear-based, but it can also be hope-based. But I think the problem, a couple of problems come up. One is if you create this ideal that you're hoping for that devalues the actual person in front of you, then that becomes somewhat problematic. But maybe more importantly, you know, what are the boundaries of your hope? And I think this is where the Christian faith and other faiths that point to a transcendent reality, you know, call us to a hope that we cannot see, that is not a worldly hope. And if the boundaries of what you're trying to do are limited to this kind of worldly interest, then you better be careful, because there's more to the human person than that. And so this interest that people have in eliminating suffering and failing to perhaps see the value and the beauty and the need perhaps for suffering, maybe because of the limits of where they think they can place their hope. So that's clear or not?
Yeah, can I also add that I think, I like your idea about reaching for hope. I think that's not something I thought about, and that's helpful. But to what extent, think about the distinction between human dignity and personal dignity that's in one of the essays that Mr. St. Thomas
in the
Dr.
Meilaender,
Zins yeah. But to what extent does suffering, or in what circumstances does suffering handicap human dignity, right, our ability to flourish at different capacities, right? To what extent does suffering allow us to flourish, and to what extent does it hinder us, and in what circumstances, right, the dignity that is relatively measured, to what extent can suffering help or hinder that? And I think it can go both ways.
And it's a good question, not just in relation to the self, but I think to others, like the way in which we respond to others who are suffering, I think is a way in which we grow in so many virtues. So, not that that should be, that's the main purpose of suffering, but it's certainly, I think we could say it.
Absolutely.
I just think of a few phrases from the Bible that come to mind when thinking about what Dr. Billings and Ms. Gallagher and Dr. and Mrs. Zins have just said, just how like Christ is made perfect in weakness. So when humans are weak, Christ can shine through. And how Christ also calls us to rejoice in our sufferings and not to be worried about it, because he also suffered and understood it, and ultimately he has conquered ultimate suffering and ultimate death. So there's a hope there that isn't predicated on needing to fix something ourselves, because we can't ultimately. And in the Christian tradition, getting back to what can Christianity add to this discussion, it can add that hope that isn't based on needing to fix everything. It's the hope on that we are made in the image of God, both as rational beings and also that we can reflect his image in our experience in this world.
And I think to look at other biblical examples, I think it's very telling that the New Testament is full of stories about Christ comforting and loving, in particular, those who are suffering, those who are disabled in some way, physically or emotionally or some other way.
And I'll add too, just from the Meilaender essay, he gives an example of I think he calls it a virtuoso violinist who has dementia. And he's talking about how that sort of doesn't erase the dignity of the violinist, even though he or she may not have the same skills that they once had. So that's how he distinguishes between human dignity and personal dignity, right? So a violinist, maybe who is a great concert performer, loses their ability to play well because they have this mental dementia condition. That may decrease their, what he would call a human dignity, meaning their sort of ability to contribute to society, but it doesn't diminish their personal dignity. But then he goes on to say something that was really striking. He says, well, if we use that as our example of like how that person still has dignity, what is that saying about where we place that person in the first place, right? Because he says, theoretically, whether it's a virtuoso violinist or I think he says like the lady who takes the trash out in my office has dementia, we should consider both of those things, a terrible occurrence, right? Not just when someone who has tremendous amounts of skills or is a star in some way loses that ability. I thought that was really good. He doesn't seem to see a ton of hope for non-religious based ethics to account for that kind of dignity. Right? In other words, he talks about the Judeo-Christian tradition and how this tradition offers us that chance to make the virtuoso violinist and the maid in the office sort of equal persons. He doesn't seem to see a lot of hope in secular science to account for that kind of dignity. Any thoughts on that? Whether this could be an understanding, of given dignity that you can reach without a necessarily religious outlook. He says that you might be able to get there if you account for the finality of death, and that if you recognize the importance of death, then that sort of might lead you to consider all life equal. I don't know, any thoughts from the scientists or the theologians on the necessity of a religious outlook for this kind of ethics? That's where I get to step behind the podium and pretend like I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I think that scientists are like to kind of have relative self-governance in many of these kind of this decision-making process. So just speaking from that point of view, if you were to ask a scientist, any scientist, I don't know necessarily what they would say to that question, but I would imagine that many of the thoughts of scientists on a bioethicist would be relatively the same. The one thing I've been thinking of a little bit is, I think a kind of central question in bioethics would be, all right, if we have the ability to limit suffering, do we then have the obligation to do so? And then is not doing so akin to causing said suffering? Which I think is an interesting question. And as far as the idea of the finality of death goes, maybe a bioethicist might say something, well, if we can control something, then, is it, if we can push back that date or whatever, extend someone's lifetime, is that something we're obligated to do? And I'm thinking of, it's not quite related to gene editing, but I actually saw a news clip the other day, very fortuitous, this about, I forget who it was, pitcher on the Astros who, Huntington's is carried in his family. He doesn't know if he has it necessarily. But Huntington's is basically a neurodegenerative disorder. It's a genetic disorder, and the symptoms don't appear until an individual will be around their late 30s to 50s. And once they start, it's a fatal disorder. So it's a pretty serious and grim thing. And he and his wife, who's actually my sports reporter, Al LaForce, are going through IVF, where they're going to screen the embryos and hopefully, and they will implant one that does not have this allele that will lead to Huntington's. And the question then becomes, right, is that the right thing to do necessarily? Should they just accept kind of that truth as their lives, or should they be able to do something about it? Which I thought was, I thought it was an interesting article. That's just an aside.
Well, back to your original question, the big question. As I understand it, you're sort of, I'll try to paraphrase it. Can there be human dignity without God?
To the extent that we would like, I guess, right? That's not some utilitarian dignity on how well you achieve something.
I guess I would say in the history of philosophy, you have people coming down on either side of that question. I think, like Dostoevsky, what was the quotation? If there is no God, everything is permitted.
Yes. Yeah.
Sort of ethics go out the window with gods. I think there's a force to that approach, or even Immanuel Kant talked about the need to have sort of immortality, to have your soul judged as a standard for being moral in this world. I mean, if it all stops when you die, then whatever, but if you got this sort of judgment, that sort of provides an emphasis to being moral. Thomas More talks about that in Utopia, right? That the utopians didn't trust people who didn't believe that they would be judged eternally, because it gave them sort of a green light to do whatever they wanted morally. So there are a lot of people who would argue, yeah, you need that kind of religious foundation to really have authentic human dignity. On the other hand, you've got people who, on the other side, who find ways to express some form of morality and ethics without that. I personally don't find that as compelling, but people try to do that. Back to this idea about suffering, I did want to point out there's a well-known ethical tradition, I don't know if you call it a tradition, but a position called utilitarianism. I don't know if you've heard about this, which basically, tries to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number. And what that usually means is to maximize good feeling and minimize suffering. So the kind of standard that the utilitarian ethics would use is suffering to minimize it, right? And to maximize good feeling. So this ends up with actually some pretty extreme moral claims. Guy at Princeton, right? Is he still there? Peter Singer. Advocating things like infanticide, or anything to stop the suffering, which it does end up in some pretty outrageous suggestions that most of us would not immediately consider to be moral things to do, but I guess they seem to diminish suffering. Anyways, I just wanted to point out that there is an ethical tradition that would emphasize this, minimizing of suffering as a sort of cornerstone of their ethical position. It's one which certainly the Catholic Church does not embrace, and to the contrary, it has a long tradition of saints and moral theologians who point to suffering as, in a way, therapeutic and beneficial, and embracing our cross. The center of our faith is a crucified Christ. Sorry, that wasn't organized.
No,
Just throwing it out.
great. Anyone else in that question? Or?
Well, it certainly seems if you're gonna use death as, not that it's a problem, but the thing to consider is if you're gonna use death as sort of the great equalizer, right, here's what we all share, and we all have to face at one point, it opens up personal dignity to more than just the human race, right? This is something that we all face, so now we have to consider questions, and maybe this certainly relates to another question on there, but then the question is our dignity unique from, compared to other kinds of creatures? And if you use death as sort of the grounding, as a way to escape or to substitute for the Judeo-Christian basis of personal dignity, that opens up that question, right? Is our dignity unique compared to other creatures? It certainly seems not, if that's your belief.
Yeah, I mean, we could get to question number 2, actually, because that's kind of tangential. This is actually Annie's question. It's a great question, I thought. What is the Christian stance on, say, genetic experimentation when we're not talking about human life? We're talking about animals. Is it sort of anything goes? Is it, I mean, obviously you have maybe a difference between like a lab rat and like a, I don't know, a polar bear or something, right? I don't know. What is the church, or just Christian ethics, what kind of distinctions do they make?
Well, in the Catholic tradition, I think we can go back to the book of Genesis as a good basis for the inspiration to value all of creation, because it's a story of creation where God is intimately involved with the creation of all species and everything that exists. So there's certainly that, for starters, is this fundamental goodness of all creation, which we should never forget. And secondly, that humans are placed in a role of stewardship. It's translated different ways. I guess dominion, have dominion, which I've always distinguished from domination. It doesn't say that you can do with it whatever you want. The sense of that story is that we are in a position of responsibility towards this good creation that God has given to us and placed us in the midst of. So right there, I think you get an inspiration to treat everything with respect, even the material world, to treat it with respect. Saint Benedict talks about, how monks should treat all the tools of the monastery as if they were sacred vessels in church. I think it's that sort of inspiration, sort of Saint Francis' sense of all of creation has a fundamental dignity, in that sense, as being created by God and fundamentally good. So that would discount, just randomly torturing animals or treating them as if, they were worthless or something like that, or simply at our disposal, would go against not only that sense of Genesis, but really the whole sort of gist of the Catholic moral teaching. However, the role of being stewards does empower us to domesticate them, to use them to our benefit, and even eventually to eat them. Although in the original story of Genesis, we're not given animals.
They were
to eat.
vegans, I think.
Yeah, it's just the fruits and I forget the seed, I just read it in mass, the seed-bearing fruit or whatever is given, not animals, but after the fall.
Right.
Then people are eating animals, but it's as if there's something kind of wrong, not originally good about that. So I think we don't have carte blanche with how we treat animals, but we are entitled to, as it says, have dominion over them. We have some jurisdiction.
Just to give people a background of what animal experimentation actually entails, speaking as someone who's done some of this work before, you have to, thankfully, jump through a lot of hoops to do any type of animal research. There needs to be a very specific rationale. You need to demonstrate that your work will, one, use the minimum number of animals, and two, provide a tangible benefit to human health with the result of your work. And the types of experiments you can do with them need to be administered in a way that is not just carte blanche torture of animals, unnecessary, pain-induced. It needs to be, everything you do, down to the smallest thing, needs to be documented and done for a specific reason. And you need to administer pain medication and just like you would any human patient, and if you're inducing a wound or something like that. So properly, and overall I should say the goal is to move away from animal models of research. And the reason why we use animal models of research is because findings from certain organisms have very close relation to what would happen in a human physiology. But overall, the goal is to move away from that, and with one series of animals, chimps, we've hit that mark. You are no longer allowed to use chimps in medical research, and so all the ones that were in labs have been sent away to sanctuaries where they can live out the rest of their lives, not in a lab and not in danger of being part of a study anymore.
Is that a global standard?
Anything that uses National Institutes of Health funding, which crosses United States boundaries in the sense of collaborative groups and stuff like that. I don't think it's a global standard in the sense that you are not allowed to use chimps anywhere, but the NIH is the single biggest grantor of medical research dollars in the world, with a $35 billion a year budget for medical research. So if you get any funds from the US government, you are not allowed to use chimps for research. And typically the animal models are limited to rats, mice, but again, even though we may think them insignificant, the numbers need to be limited. You have to administer a care and use protocol that will account for everything you're doing, have a rationale behind it that's directly tied to human health benefit, and then with the overall goal of moving to models that do not require these animals.
Maybe one more question, then we can kind of open it up here.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead. I also was wondering in terms of genetic mutation of animals, what would sort of be out of bounds there? I'm assuming if the byproduct would be painful or non-survivable, or if it creates an animal that had horrible difficulties because of what you did, what would be considered legitimate?
So that line is a little grayer, just currently where this research is. Like there are mice that are bred, for instance, to be diabetic, so that they are more an example of a chronically healing wound model. There are, when I used to work for the Navy, our job was establishing wound models in animals that soldiers were experiencing in battle, with the idea, could we understand how wound healing works and accelerate it so that it would be directly translatable to a military application to alleviate soldiers' wounds. So it's tough. It's a tough line, but when you get into those types of research, you really need to make your case that what you're doing will translate to something that can be used relatively quickly to help human flourishing, or lack of a better phrase. But again, the overall goal is to move away from that.
One question I had that sort of just came to me when Mitch was talking about IVF, in vitro fertilization. So for a number of reasons, the church would have a problem with the creation of individual embryos with the hope that one of those embryos would be the healthiest or the least prone to disease, because it would involve the disposal of those embryos when they're not needed for implantation later on, which the church kind of equates with the destruction of human life. Would this genetic editing therapeutically be a better option If the church actually does teach what Father Nicanor suggests, that therapeutic genetic editing is something that's acceptable. I mean, could this be an avenue where the church could say we could mitigate some long-term diseases that are preventable without necessarily destroying an existing embryo? I'm sure the church doesn't have a position on this yet officially, right, because it's so new. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.
I'm not expert in this, but
Yeah.
I would think a standard that would come to mind for me is if there's something that you feel it's legitimate to treat post-birth, why not treat it pre-birth?
Right.
I mean, if it's kind of a therapeutic, beneficial thing to do, it would happen at any stage, it would be legitimate. And certainly preferable to the destruction of, if life begins at conception,
Right.
human life.
Yeah, it's certainly thought-provoking. It sounds like there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of research and trial here for this to be, I mean, this isn't even accepted really in the community yet, right? I mean, is this legal?
It's used in labs to do like experiments on cells
Yeah.
to knock out certain proteins to test their effect, but as far as a therapy, no.
So it's still kind of theoretical at this point.
Mhm.
Good, well, before we take questions, let's say thank you to each of the panelists. This is, they're in the firing line here. I get to just stand behind the podium and play Alex Trebek. They have to actually answer the questions. What questions do you guys have? For any, yeah.
This is a little bit off topic, but what about, like IVF for when babies aren't born, like, naturally? Like, how does the ethical conversation come into that? Like, what do you guys think about it?
Well, I think what Mr. St. Thomas was saying, the primary concern from the church's perspective is that usually it involves the creation of multiple embryos, many of which end up being destroyed in the process. So I think that's the primary objection. Because if we believe that life begins at conception, sort of the wasteful destruction, harmful destruction of human life in that process. And there are other concerns, I think, more towards what we're talking about here in terms of human dignity, taking control and feeling the autonomy to choose specific traits that are better than others, and all those questions come into play here. Again, the ones that we've been talking about before. But from a moral standpoint, what's ethically wrong from the church's perspective is the destruction of human life.
And also, I would add that our, and this connects to this discussion of weakness and suffering, our moral obligation, this came up in our discussion, I guess, last year about abortion. Our moral obligation increases when vulnerability increases. So we're not less morally obligated to an embryo. We're more morally obligated. It enhances and increases, our call to care and nurture and develop. And so the experience of weakness, I think, from the Christian perspective, it's not a point to be eliminated or devalued in any way, but as a call, in a way it's a vocation to love and care. So I think, beyond just the point that, life begins, so therefore we're obligated, but also that in this supreme vulnerability is also an enhanced, not a decreased, moral obligation.
That imperative that you're
Lila, yeah.
How would you determine whether or not, for scientists and for a baby that is going to be suffering in the future, rather than someone that's already suffering, is there a difference between helping them genetically since they're not technically born yet?
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more?
Like, if you can fix the problem while like before the baby is conceived, like is that different than like fixing the problem once the person is already like grown up or like conceived?
I mean, in terms of fixing the problem, as in like therapeutic editing or like termination of?
Well, no, like therapeutic editing, like not.
So you're saying, does it justify it, or?
Well, like where's the line like drawn, or like which one is more accepted?
Yeah, Lila, I think one thing that I don't think we touched on yet, but is certainly interesting, is the difference between making genetic edits in what would be known as the germline versus somatic cells. So if this were, say, something like sickle cell anemia that targets red blood cells, or another disorder that targets the somatic cells, then certainly making edits in those cells, right, which would then not be able to be passed down to that individual's offspring, right, is seen as a little more permissible than, say, making an edit in a fertilized egg, which will then go on to become every single cell in the body, and therefore that change can pass down from generation to generation. So if we're talking about a certain disease that would target a very specific cell type, we could make those edits, that's seen as more, generally more permissible. It's when, and again, this is not like we mentioned a few minutes ago, this is not like something that we can just go ahead and do in 2 days, right? There's still a ton of research that needs to be done. And there's a huge difference between cells in a dish versus in a human. But we haven't yet made that distinction. I think would be important to just, that's one of the places where a line can be drawn.
Annie?
So kind of like in terms of experimentation on animals, I know like we kind of touched on this before, but, so, like how do scientists justify like what kind of animal is better to experiment on? Like, let's say for example, like, from like fruit flies or something to like bears, like where do scientists draw the line and say it's like immoral to experiment on this type of animal, or like it's better to experiment on like, I don't really know, but like, how do scientists kind of like rank animals in terms of like what's more permissible or what's more appropriate to experiment on?
That's a good question. The reason why certain animals are chosen or widely used is because they have very similar genetic backgrounds or physiologies to humans. They're not directly translatable, but they are as close as you can get. And also some animals are chosen because they have a relatively small genome, or if you knock out certain genes, they give very distinct traits in the offspring. So that's the case in roundworms and fruit flies and things like that. As far as mice and rats, they are the closest thing we have, basically. It sounds weird, but they're the closest like genetic background we have to a human physiology. All the organs are set up in a very similar way. The same genes control the same processes, but again, it's in a mouse and it's not a human. But it's not like we're gonna say, oh, we're gonna go experiment on this goat, because it's not one of the model organisms that has been shown over the course of scientific research to have very translatable properties to human health. So there's a very limited list of animals that you are even allowed to work with. And you're only allowed to work with them in very specific situations. So you can't just go ahead and experiment on anything willy-nilly. There are long established protocols for it. So as far as ranking them, is if you're working on this particular system, this is the animal you use, that type of thing.
The neighbors don't like the goat experimentation either. It's not
Strangely,
good for the
ferrets
housekeeping.
have the same cellular receptor distribution that humans do in the lungs. So ferrets are how you model passage of the flu. Like again, you would not think of this, but ferrets have the closest lung protein distribution that humans do. So ferrets are used to model the passage of the flu from person to person.
Davey?
If they want to start using like CRISPR in humans, like how will they like if they want to make sure there's no negative side effects, will they have to like do it on humans first, kind of, if that makes sense? Like, would they have to experiment with the humans, or would they be able to, like, determine beforehand?
So I think with a lot of these treatments, one, you couldn't experiment on humans, like it's not allowed. Like you can't do human trials in the sense, if there's a very, very good chance that the human would die, that person would die, or if you really had no idea what the side effects would be. So really, the first cases would really be when there was no other avenue, like many experimental treatments. Like the case where a woman had a very severe brain tumor and the doctor was like, okay, the measles virus infects the cells that are in this tumor very well. Normally, I'm going to inject the equivalent of 10,000 measles vaccine doses into this woman's head. All right, that's not something you would do normally, but it was certain death otherwise. The doctor did it. The measles preferentially killed those cancer cells. The tumor was gone, and it did not touch any of the healthy cells. So I imagine it would be a series of those types of treatments, especially if we were dealing with somatic cell issues, and then closely monitoring those patients to see what types of side effects may occur months, years, decades down the line.
Yeah, Lila?
When like using CRISPR on like a mother or father, like in fact like a few generations later in a negative way, like would it show up not like in the next generation but maybe like the next or the next? Like it might work well for the first few and then like stop working.
I mean, we don't really know, but again, it would be, are you editing a germline cell or are you editing a non-germline cell? If you're editing a non-germline cell, you're most likely not going to get any effect on subsequent generations. But if you're editing the germline, we don't know.
Yeah, Ken?
If, could you use CRISPR to prevent something like autism? And if, that person were to have, children, would they have a high chance of having autism?
So we still don't really know what causes autism. So we don't really have a target. We have correlations. We have genes that are shown to be a predisposition to autism. There are certain microbiome constitutions that predispose autism, but as far as having a target for CRISPR, we don't have one. And I highly doubt that autism would be a case where it would be one gene, one condition, because it's such a complex developmental condition.
Dan?
Earlier you guys were talking about life as a gift, and I was just trying to, and that brings up the question for me is editing anything in like the genome ethical? Because I'm sure you've heard of the term playing God, and I was just, is that like, should you be tampering, with life in any sort of way? Do you believe that CRISPR is playing God, and if so, is it still acceptable?
Question?
I think Dr. Billings talked about our moral obligation to protect and help the vulnerable, right? So we certainly have an obligation to prevent certain kinds of suffering if it's in our capacity. And that goes beyond, obviously, biology, right? To be a friend to someone who's suffering, right? We have an obligation to alleviate suffering to a certain degree. So I think it would be short-sighted to say that we should never get involved and never prevent suffering. I guess that's what we're here to talk about, is how you determine where you draw the line. And it sounds like the main problem is that there's not enough research to know what kinds of effects CRISPR has. That's what it sounds like. We don't know enough in the scientific community. But
I mean, Dan, you're talking about CRISPR alleviating suffering through genetic manipulation rather than say,
Well, yeah.
a pill, or some other, way.
Yeah, I feel like it is kind of different from a pill because you're actually changing like who you like your DNA. It's like a pill doesn't change like I don't know. I don't really know, but I feel like it is a little different from that. And does that cross the line of like changing life? I don't know if that's a good definition.
Yeah, I think you're right that it definitely has the feel more of a kind of intervening creator, right? Like you're
Mhm.
taking the position of God who is creator.
Mhm.
And for a Christian who believes that God is the creator, I think you're right that it calls into question whether any kind of gene editing is playing God. So I don't know. It's a really tough.
So it's like, we're created in God's image, but we're gonna make it a little better.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But I guess I'd return to, this distinction between therapeutic and non-therapeutic or augmentative or restorative types of interventions. And it seems to me if you can somehow use this technology to treat diseases that you would try to treat anyways some other way, and this is a more effective way, I don't see anything intrinsically wrong with that. If you're using it because you think you've got a better idea what a human should be, then I think you're doing something different that sounds a lot more like playing God to me.
Question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
A lot of this is kind of dealing with ending the suffering of people who don't really have a say for themselves. And so in the case of like euthanasia, where somebody for themselves decides that their life is just suffering and that they want to end it for themselves because it's like taking over, does the church and science still like hold the same views that they do about like anything?
Well,
Well,
the
I think for
church,
science, it depends what state I think you live in, there are different laws, but yeah, the church, I think, would say always that that's not the decision of the person to make, right? No matter how bad the suffering is, it's not a choice that we have to essentially take our own life, whether or not we have a real legitimate grief, right, to do so.
yeah, that's certainly the church teaching. In terms of what science is doing, I think you have different views, moral views, that different scientists have, and different laws, in different states. That's what's considered permissible or not, and it's kind of a moving target these days. But I think the church teaching has been pretty consistent about, valuing human life and not feeling that we have the right to terminate it. There are some. So the treatment should be primarily palliative, that you should try to make the life more comfortable or less painful or more meaningful. That's what hospice is designed to do, to make end-of-life situations more livable for people who are going through it, without taking the active step of trying to terminate that life.
And so does that kind of carry on to like if somebody's on life support and whoever's like in charge of their like medical
Well,
stuff?
there are a couple of gray areas there in terms of end-of-life issues. One would be, like if some dose of medication might have a double effect. It might, diminish their suffering, but it could put them over the edge and end their life. But I don't want that to happen, but I want to diminish their suffering. Or similarly, if someone is on life support, people refer to pulling the plug, or ceasing extraordinary means to keep them alive is called passive euthanasia. I'm not going in and trying to kill them, but I'm going to stop with this extraordinary intervention to keep them alive. And I feel there is an important moral difference there. And the church has basically said that kind of passive form can be justified. It's not always, but it can be justified. But the active intervention to terminate life cannot be justified. That's what the church is teaching, as I understand it.
Yeah, I think so. Rodolfo?
For the gene editing, how much can you wait until like it's too late to do it? How much? Can you,
Like how small or early on does the embryo have to?
what's like the latest?
Well, it's easiest, earliest, when there are only a few cells to target. But it's doable really at any time. It'll be harder to target exactly where you want, and the only cells that will be subject to that treatment are the ones that divide from that cell that you actually get the edit in. So you may not hit all, but you would hit all the ones after that one. So that's why doing it when just the embryo is a few cells old, you have a much greater chance of actually getting the edit you want in there, and then all subsequent cells will have that edit.
And is it easier to detect it before or after? When it's
Before or after what? What do you mean?
like when, depending how early it is it easier to detect what is wrong or what can be changed?
You have to do like a DNA scan, right? I mean, at some point?
So in a normal pregnancy, it's hard to do like an embryonic DNA test early. But if it's more of an IVF scenario, where you actually have like the embryo outside, you can do genetic testing on that embryo before it's implanted relatively easily.
Yeah, I mean, one more question. I'm gonna get you guys back for house meetings.
I just wanted to know, so let's say like you edited a mouse to like change some trait. How long would scientists wait to see like whether or not there are harmful side effects?
That's a good question. One benefit, or not benefit, depending on how you feel about animal research, is that mouse generation times in litters are much faster and greater than humans. So you would be able to sort of crunch the timeline. But again, it's hard to make that jump from what happens in a mouse to what happens in a human. Like, you can't directly translate it. So whatever side effects may or may not happen in a mouse may or may not be the same ones that happen in a human. So there would still be a significant amount of caution there.
Good. All right, well, I think that just about does it. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you again, our panel. Watch out for essay prompts.